In the previous videos, we've looked at sniffing and spoofing for relatively simple protocols. We've looked at, spoofing in Ethernet, spoofing in IP, spoofing in UDP, but these are all relatively simple protocols. Now let's have a look at a protocol that's infinitely more complicated, TCP, which offers many features that are not found in any of the other protocols. For instance, flow control, reliable delivery, in-order delivery, and all sorts of other complications. Okay, so let's dive in directly and look at the details of some of these things. For instance, the reliability. So reliability in TCP is provided by having this abstraction of a byte stream. So you're sending a stream of bytes and providing in every segment, so every packet if you want, that you're sending to the remote side, sequence numbers and acknowledgement numbers. Okay, the sequence numbers are used to indicate which bytes are in your packet that you're sending to the remote side, and the acknowledgement numbers tell the remote side something about which bytes you've successfully received. Okay? Specifically, the sequence number specifies the position of the segment data in the communication stream. So if you have a sequence number of 13423, it basically means this packet, this segment, contains the bytes from 13423 onwards, right? So if the segment contains 100 bytes, it basically means it contains byte number 13423, 13424, 13425, and so on for 100 bytes. Okay, that's what is contained in the segment. The acknowledgement number, on the other hand, tells a remote site about the bytes that you've successfully received. So if you have an acknowledgement number of 16754, it basically means that you've received in order and correctly all the bytes up to 16753. And that means that the first byte that you're expecting from the remote site is this 16754. So that's how we do reliability. TCP also offers flow control and congestion control, and it will detect segments that are lost, duplicated, and so on. And we're not going to look at all of the details because TCP is really quite complicated, but just highlight some of the things. So the reliability we discussed, the flow control is another thing. So TCP works with this notion of a window. I don't really care about flow control per se, but we will be using that notion of a window in later slides. Okay, so the TCP window is used to perform this flow control, and it basically means that a segment containing TCP data will only be accepted if the sequence number is inside the window. Okay, in other words, if the sequence number is inside the window that starts with the current acknowledgement number. So you have a window on the sender side and you have a window on the receiver side. And you will only accept a packet from the remote side if the acknowledgement number that you have is less than the sequence number, and the sequence number should also be less than the acknowledgement number plus the size of this window. And the size of the window gets adjusted over time, so it may be getting smaller, bigger, and so on. Okay, so that means that your packet has to be in window, and the window is exactly one window size large, running from the current acknowledgement number to the current acknowledgement number plus the window size. Now, in a later slide, we will see that there are actually more specific rules for which packets are acceptable, when, and the rules that govern them. Okay, but this is all that I want to say at this point. There is a window size for both the sender and the receiver. Then there are flags that can tell the remote party about certain things in the packet. For instance, it could tell the remote party that a connection is being set up. In that case, the SYN flag could be set, right? The SYN flag could be set to 1. Okay. There is an acknowledgement flag which indicates that the packet acknowledges data that is sent from the other side. In other words, there's only one packet where the acknowledgement flag should not be sent, right? So the one packet which doesn't acknowledge anything is a SYN packet that you send out initially. Okay, then there is a flag for shutting down, disconnecting the stream, so shutting down the stream. Another way to do this immediately, the reset. So there's a fin and the reset flag. And then there is a set of flags that we're not going to talk about. For instance, the urgent flag or the push flag. We're not super interested in those flags now, but there are some more flags. That's good. And now, if we want to set up a connection, because TCP is connection oriented, so it can actually have an end-to-end connection in which we push this stream of bytes, we need to set up this connection first. And we do this by means of this SYN packet. So it's a three-way handshake, actually. And the first thing that we do is send a SYN packet for synchronize, right? And what does it synchronize? Well, it synchronizes on, for instance, the sequence number. So if you want to set up a connection, you're sending a TCP segment without any data, but with the SYN flag set. Okay? And the only thing that you're in principle communicating is the sequence number. So you're providing the sequence number of the client to the server. So now the server knows the sequence number of the client, so it can reply with a message that acknowledges the SYN flag. So it has a SYN flag set and the acknowledgement flag set, and it acknowledges the SYN flag by having an acknowledgement number that says it's now ready to receive the sequence number of the client plus 1. So the initial sequence number that the client just sent plus 1. So that's the next byte that the server receives. Okay, and it also tells the client about its initial sequence number. So the initial sequence number of the server is the S of the server, the sequence number of the server. Okay, and after that, the client will acknowledge that packet by sending back a packet that acknowledges that has an acknowledgement number of whatever sequence number that the server sent plus 1, so the S of the server plus 1, and also the sequence number of the client plus 1. And this is the first segment, the first packet, if you want, that may contain data. Okay. After that, we have an established connection. So it's a well-known three-way handshake. Okay. So the question is, what should be the initial sequence number that is being sent by the client and by the server? Now, this has become more complicated over time. Initially, the TCP standard specified that the sequence number should be incremented every 4 microseconds. And on the old BSD Unix systems, there was a sequence. Whenever you set up a connection, it picked an initial sequence number that was incremented by 64,000 every half second, and it was also incremented by 64,000 every time you set up a new connection. So it would pick new sequences. You don't want to have sequence numbers that are too close too close to the previous value, because then what you might have is that you have a connection, it's shut down, but maybe some termination packets got lost or delayed, and now you get a new connection with a new sequence number. Maybe there may be confusion about whether or not this is actually a valid packet for the old connection. So it would be good to not have these sequence numbers overlap. But the problem is much more complicated than that, because if you know what the sequence number is, so if you're able to guess it, because maybe just like in the example that I show on the slide here, it's very easily guessable, then an attacker could also send data with the right sequence number, or at least with a sequence number that's very likely to be in window. And what can the attacker do with that? Well, it could, for instance, terminate your connections, right? You could send a packet that is a reset packet with the right sequence number, or something that approximates the right sequence number is at least in window. And that would terminate somebody else's connection. Okay. Or what the attacker could also do is try to inject data in somebody else's connection. Complicated, but you could do it. But okay, so what you need to do is get the sequence number right. And that is much more complicated these days because the sequence number is picked as a random number. Just as what we saw in the query ID in DNS, over time, picking this number has become more complicated and harder to guess. Okay, so the TCP three-way handshakes, you can actually see if you do a TCP dump of a connection. We have a connection that tries somebody tries to set up from 192.168.1.10 to 192.168.1.20. And so the first thing it does is it does an ARP request asking for the MAC address of this IP address. And then, there's an ARP reply, which says that it's at this MAC address. And then, subsequently we see a message, a TCP SYN packet being sent from 192.168.1.10 to 192.168.1.20. In this case, on port 23, which is the telnet port. And it basically tells the remote side that the sequence number is 1015043. Okay? So this is the first part of the three-way handshake. And the remote side, so the 1.20 then replies to the 1.10 with the appropriate port numbers, with a packet where the SYN flag is also set. But it's also acknowledging the data, and it basically tells the initiating party that the next byte it receives is this sequence number +1. Okay, so that's the acknowledgement number, and it also indicates its own sequence number. So the SYN flag is set for both of these. Finally, the three-way handshake is completed by the initiating party acknowledging the message that it gets from the server, from the SYN ACK that it just receives, by sending an ACK packet. No SYN flag is set anymore. It just acknowledges it, and it acknowledges it with the number that is the sequence number that was sent by the remote side +1. Yeah. Okay. One more thing. So the client sends a message to port 23. This should be a well-known port 23. In this particular case, it's a telnet port, but the client should know the port. That's the point. But the port that it uses here can be picked at random, right? So there's no regulations about that. So because it's sent in the packet anyway, the remote side will know that it has to reply to this port. So port 1026 in this particular case. So the first 1024 ports are reserved ports, but we're going to ignore that, most of that. But for instance, port 23, and the fact that I know about this is the port for telnet. Okay, port 25 is a port for SMTP, and there are port 80 is the port for web traffic, and so on. Okay, so that's a three-way handshake. Now, once we have the connection, we can start sending data with sequence numbers, with acknowledgement numbers, so that the remote side knows which bytes are being received. So maybe one packet got lost, but then you get a packet with a sequence number that is a little bit further, and that means that you're still missing some data, so that has to be retransmitted. TCP will take care of all of that. But at some point, you're done communicating, and then you have to shut down. Okay, you have to tear down the connection. And this is initiated by one of the parties, could be the client, could be the server. But the way it shuts down the connection is by sending a packet with the FIN flag set. So here we see that the host 1.20 is terminating the connection by sending a packet with the FIN flag set. Okay. The other party will then answer with an acknowledgement segment. So here we see there's an acknowledgement sent in response to the FIN flag. Okay. The terminating side will not send any data anymore to the other side. Okay, so A will not send any data to B, but it will acknowledge all the data that it will receive from B. Okay, and then B will, in addition to sending this acknowledgement, it will also send a fin segment of its own. Right, it will send a fin segment of its own, and that will be acknowledged by the party that initially started terminating the connection. So, and then there's some timeouts there, and it's a little complicated, and can never be 100% sure that the connection is properly torn down. But it's a reasonable approximation. This is how it works. Okay, so now that we've seen the connection setup and the connection tear down, it's useful to mention that there's another way of doing a connection tear down, and it is by sending a packet with a reset flag set, and that doesn't lead to this long-winded termination sequence. It just immediately disconnects the. And for completeness, I mentioned that we can use this information to scan to see what kind of services are running on a remote site. You can try to set up connections, for instance, to a remote site and see where we actually get a response, where we get a SYNAC, for instance, and then you know that at that port number, there must be a server listening. And that means if it's a well-known port, so if there's a response on port 80, there's probably a web server running on that machine. And if there's a response on port 25, there's probably a mail server on that machine, and so on. But we'll get to scanning later. First, I want to talk about some other complicated stuff, and actually more complicated stuff, which is hijacking. Okay, so why doesn't it flip? Oh, here we go. So we want to spoof TCP, and that means that we want to send a TCP segment pretending to be someone who we're not. And this is complicated because, as we have mentioned early on in this course, when you send a packet to a remote server, that remote server is going to respond to the IP address that is in that packet. Okay, and if we're spoofing the packet, it will reply to somebody else, and that means that if we're sending a packet, for instance, a SYN packet to a remote server, the server is going to send its SYNAC to somebody else. Right? We don't see that unless we're on the same local area network. And that means that we don't know the right sequence number that the server is using. Okay, that's complicated. And to solve this, we have a number of fairly sophisticated attacks. And we're going to start with a classic one, which is also one of the most famous ones. So it was first discussed by Robert Tappan Morris, whom we know from the Morris work in a paper that he wrote. It was called A Weakness in the 4.2 BSD Unix TCP/IP Software in 1985. And it was very famously used by Kevin Mitnick in his attack against the San Diego Supercomputer Center. So these are the three main players here. Robert Morris, because he wrote about the technique. And then we had Kevin Mitnick, who was the proverbial bad guy. And we had the administrator of the San Diego Supercomputer Center called Tsutomu Shimomura. Okay, and this is a stuff of legends, right? So we've actually seen books written about this attack. We've seen movies about this attack. It's a fairly bad movie, if you ask me, but it's a movie with Tom Berenger, which is called Takedown, and it has Kevin Mitnick and Tsutomu Shimomura in a sort of a cat and mouse game, chasing each other. Okay, and it's kind of a bad movie. There are also some other books. So Freedom Downtown talks about some of this. Other movies. And there's a book about this, the Takedown, and it was written by indeed Tsutomu Shimomura. So this is what this movie is also based on, and not surprisingly, in the movie, it's actually Shimomura who's the really cool guy. At least that's how I perceive it. Anyway, let's not talk about the movie. Let's talk about what they've done. So what they've done is what Kevin Mitnick did was try to attack from a machine remote from the victim, so far away across the internet. It would attack a machine on the San Diego Supercomputer Center. And he first discovered that there is a trust relationship between two machines within the San Diego Supercomputer Center. Okay, specifically, node A, which is a terminal, node A, the victim, as we shall see, has a trust relationship with a server, which means that the server can simply log into this machine without requiring a username and password. It would use the RSH command, the remote shell command, to do so. Okay, so node A trusts node B. So what the attacker wants to do, what Kevin Mitnick wanted to do, was impersonate node B, talk to node A, change the permissions on node A such that now anybody can log in from anywhere and not require a username or password. Okay, so node C wants to impersonate node B with respect to A in opening a TCP connection. And to do so, what Mitnick did was he would kill node B. So he would launch a denial of service attack against node B. Okay, so that means that node B is down, or at least no longer responding to anything. And that's important because he would then set up, Mitnick would then set up a TCP connection. So it would send a TCP SYN segment with a sequence number for the attacker, which is really, because it's a spoofed packet, pretending to be a packet that is sent by the trusted server, which is now down. Okay, so there's a sequence number in there for the trusted server, and after that, node A will reply with a SYN ACK to this server, which is down. So even though there's a SYN ACK being sent to the server will not notice anything out of the ordinary, which, if it would actually be alive, it would send a reset packet to the to node A, because after all, it never tried to set up any connection. So why would it get a SYN ACK from the terminal from A? And now that it's out of business, it cannot reply. It's too busy, so it doesn't do anything. But now Mitnick cannot actually see this in exchange, so it doesn't see the packet, but has somehow guessed the right sequence number. Okay, he must have guessed the right sequence number. Now, this can happen in two ways, right? So you guess it by maybe observing some pattern, or if you happen to be on the same local area network as these two, you can maybe observe it, right? So you can just sniff the traffic. But so in this case, Mitnick was remote, and therefore he had to guess the right sequence number. Okay? So this is the same attack illustrated with the actual packets that were sent. So here's a packet from the IP address of Kevin Mitnick's machine to the I should say the spoofed IP address of this trusted server to the victim. Okay, it would set up a connection, so it had a SYN flag set, not the ACK flag, not the FIN flag. Okay, and it has its own sequence number, initial sequence number. So the victim would then reply to this trusted server, that's the same IP address there, with the appropriate acknowledgement number, so that's the sequence number +1, and its sequence number that Kevin Mitnick cannot observe, but still somehow was able to guess. So he would guess the number and then send another spoofed packet pretending to be from the trusted server, which would be dead, so it hence a kill, kill, kill. And it would have the right acknowledgement number and the right sequence number, so as to be accepted by the victim. So somehow you have to be able to guess the sequence number, and this should be in a more secure environment as difficult as possible. So there have been some RFCs that try to improve sequence number generation to make it more random. And at some point, Michael Zalewski investigated how random the sequence numbers of different operating systems really were, right? And then he repeated the experiment a couple of years later. Okay. And the way he did that was, so he looked at, sequences of sequence numbers, sequences of initial sequence numbers, and plotted them in a three-dimensional graph, right? So what he did was he would subtract Sn minus 1 from Sn, and that would be plotted on the z-axis. And then he would subtract Sn minus 2 from Sn minus 1, and he would plot that on the y-axis, and Sn minus 3 would be subtracted from Sn minus 2, and we would plot it on the x-axis. Now, what that would do, so it doesn't have any direct meaning or value, but if you see patterns there, it means it's definitely not random. You should not see any patterns if it's truly random. Okay, and just to illustrate, what he found on in those days, Windows 2000 or XP, is not entirely random. There's definitely some patterns here. It's not uniform across the space. It looks like, my perspective, a little bit like a rendering of a cube. But that's not the worst. So here's Windows 95, 98. So that's super non-random. Linux was a little bit better, perhaps. FreeBSD even better than that. And Cisco iOS, before it got fixed, was not random at all. After it was fixed, I'm not sure if you can see all the individual dots, but it's definitely much, much better there. macOS looked, reasonably random. But HP Unix, when it still existed, definitely had some non-randomness there. Anyway, so there was a way, if you observed patterns, you could perhaps predict the sequence number, and that's exactly what Robert Morris described. Okay, it was sequence number prediction. Just observe a pattern of sequence numbers, and then you can predict the next sequence number. So you don't really hijack an existing connection. You're setting up a new connection. It's a spoofed TCP connection. And that was used by the attack by Kevin Mitnick in 1994. And you're going to hear more about that in your assignment. Nowadays, pulling off the Mitnick attack is actually super complicated. You can't do it anymore. But there are other types of attack. And I want to discuss a number of them. So the first one that I want to discuss is the Jean Jaurès attack. Okay, this was slightly after Kevin Mitnick. It was 1995, and it was described in a paper called A Simple Active Attack Against TCP. And here we're going to make some simplifying assumptions. For instance, that we know the sequence numbers because we can observe it. Maybe we're on the same local area network. Just for simplicity, because I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about what happens if you hijack a connection. And later on, it's not a big problem that we make this simplifying assumption, because later on we're going to look at more advanced attacks that only emerged relatively recently. In fact, one of them very recently, to drop that simplifying assumption, right? So we no longer have to have visibility locally. Okay. So we will skip the details of the Jean Jaurès attack and just talk about some of the things that are also interesting about hijacking. Okay, Jean Jaurès was at least an attack to hijack an existing connection. So there was a connection between A and B already, a client and a server. And then the attacker inserts spoofed TCP segments to inject data into this stream. So, there's a connection between client and server. Maybe you're sending data to the server or to the client, right? And inject some data of your own. Okay. Could be, for instance, if there's a remote connection to a shell, maybe you want to have some shell commands executed, for instance, right? Or the other thing that you could do with that injection is to reset an existing connection. We already saw that you send a reset packet. Okay, to do this, you have to have the appropriate sequence and acknowledgement numbers. And we saw that Kevin Mitnick was able to predict them. It's much more complicated these days, but let's just say, for simplification, reasons that the attacker can observe the traffic. He's in the same local area network, or magically knows these sequence and acknowledgement numbers. Okay, so what the attacker will do, let's say he is indeed on this local area network, he will sniff some traffic, see all the packets, and maybe wait until the connection is quiet, so it's no longer actively sending lots of packets. Okay. And then the attacker injects a number of bytes, say 30 bytes, and in this particular case, he sends that to the server, pretending to be coming from the client. So he spoofs the packet, injects his data in the connection towards the server. What will happen? Think about this for a second before you go to the next slide. Maybe pause the slide and think about what may happen. Okay. And once you know that, what can be done to help this? Okay. Well, so you're inserting traffic into an existing connection. And that means that the server is going to be a little bit confused. Right? So here is illustrated graphically. We're sending a spoof TCP packet with the appropriate sequence number, the sequence number of the client, and 30 bytes of data. What will happen is that the server side is going to acknowledge that data. It will receive the data, looks like legit data, right? And so it will, thank the client for sending this wonderful data by sending an acknowledgement, right? And the acknowledgement is going to have an acknowledgement number that has the client's sequence number plus 30, right? That's what the client will receive. But the client will say, wait a minute, you're confused. Something's wrong. I never sent this data. Let me tell you what the real sequence number is. So it will send an acknowledgement back to the server and say the sequence number is the client sequence number. What happens then? Well, the server gets confused and said, oh, wait a minute, here's an old acknowledgement that I'm receiving from the client. I'm way past that. The client must have, missed some of the communication, must perhaps have missed the acknowledgements that I've sent earlier. Let me acknowledge that again, right? And so it sends back an acknowledgement saying that, thanks for the data. The new data that I'm now expecting is the original client sequence number plus 30. And the client's going to say, no, you're wrong. It has to be the sequence number is client sequence number, and this will go on until hell freezes over, or more precisely, until connection is dropped, or maybe some data gets lost. Okay, because empty acknowledgements will not be retransmitted in TCP. Okay, this is known as an ACK storm. We'll get lots and lots of ACKs. Okay, so just to recap this. So the receiver of the injected data sends an acknowledgement to the apparent sender that was actually not the real sender because the attacker was the sender. And the apparent sender then replies with an acknowledgement with the expected sequence number. And the receiver considers this out of sync, right? And then sends back an acknowledgement with the expected sequence number and so on. Okay. So the acknowledgement messages are not retransmitted if they don't have any data. So if they're lost, they don't get retransmitted. So the ACK storm dies as soon as one of those acknowledgements gets lost. Any subsequent attempt to communicate, however, will reestablish this problem that these two sides are out of sync. So what can we do to help that? Well, what we could do is simply send an use ARP poisoning to send these acknowledgements into no-no land, right? So make sure that they disappear by having them sent to some non-existing hardware address. This is what we saw much earlier, right? A couple of videos ago, we looked at this and said that this ARP poisoning can be used as a denial of service attack also, and that's what we could use well here. The other thing that we could do is simply reset the packet, right? Reset the connection by sending a reset to both sides, and then we're done. Both sides will experience a reset, but this happens all the time, so they'll probably recover from that. Or what we could do is block the ACK storms by the attacker using an acknowledgement packet with the right sequence numbers. Okay, so then you're also fine. So these are some of the tricks that we can use. Okay, here's another iteration of the desynchronization. So now we're talking about TCP hijacking. You're taking over an existing connection. And what's really nice, if we are able to desynchronize these connections so much that all the packets that are sent from the server are automatically dropped by the client, and all the packets that are sent by the client are automatically dropped by the server because they're so far out of window. They're completely desynchronized. That would be great, because then nothing ever happens. There's no ACK storms there either. Okay, so all the data sent by the client and server will be out of window. But the attacker, if he sees this data, can still relay it so as to make sure that as far as the client and server are concerned, so that both endpoints are concerned, the connection seems to work, except that everything is now relayed via the attacker. Okay, you can use this against the client and the server to completely hijack the TCP connection and launch a man-in-the-middle attack. So this early desynchronization can also be achieved in slightly different ways. For instance, whenever in the very initial stages, an attacker sees a SYN ACK going from this server to the client, right? The client has set up a SYN packet, the server replies, it can very quickly send the reset segment to the server. So the server will drop that connection, but the client is not aware of this, right? So the client will still proceed as if there is a connection. Okay, and very quickly afterwards, the attacker sets up a new connection to the server, okay, with the same port number and, of course, a different secrets number. The same apparent sender, right? So it's the same client, spoofed client IP address, but a different port number. Okay? Now, the client is unaware of this, right? It assumes that it is just receiving the SYN ACK, the second phase of the TCP handshake, and it will reply with the third phase of the TCP handshake, which the server, because it's completely desynchronized, will ignore. Okay? The server will reply with a SYN ACK to the attacker, well, actually to the client, which the client will ignore, and the attacker, of course, acknowledges that SYN ACK. Okay? Now the server is in the established state and the client was already in an established state. So they can both communicate with the attacker, right? But they don't, hinder each other when they send communication, send data to each other, because it will be all out of window.